Thank you very much. I'm glad to be visiting with you in, whatever capacity is doable. I think that many of us in Extension are kind of by nature more in-person people, but I think overall we've been transitioning reasonably well. So I'm excited to talk to y'all today about warm season crops, and we're going to be kind of focusing on the early end of the spectrum. I don't know if you can tell, but I brought some props with me, so you can imagine that I would have brought these with me if I'd been in person. So we're going to talk a little bit kind of about the main categories of some of the warm season crops that we grow in our gardens, soil temps, when to get them started, some of the key cultivars. So you're going to hear little snippets from our home garden variety trials and some of the different trials that we do specifically to benefit home gardeners. And then we'll try to leave some time at the end. We might not go outside today. It is rather blustery out there for me right now, but we'll have plenty of time to visit and talk about any of the questions that y'all have. So warm season, we're going to kind of divide these into from seed and from transplant. So, our beans, our corn, okra, pumpkins, a lot of our squash will start from seed. I guess I kind of put cucumbers, muskmelons, and watermelons kind of in the intermediate category. They can be started successfully from seeds, but there's also some times when transplants can be a real benefit to us. And then our peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants are always solidly going to be in the transplant category. So we're going to kind of look at them that way. And we're going to talk about some main cultural practices. We're going to talk about some main environmental conditions, and then, some of our favorite varieties. So this is just kind of an overview for y'all who may be home gardening for the first time this year. I hope you get some valuable information. For some of y'all experts, by all means, put notes in, share your experiences with other folks, and I'll be sharing some about our trial results. So beans are, of course, maybe one of the quintessential Southern crops. And so even in home garden variety trialing, I tread very lightly when it comes to beans because a lot of people have their own personal favorites. And so beans are great because they're kind of a moderate fertility crop. So when we talk about corn, when we talk about tomatoes, even some of our leafy greens, those are going to be fairly high nutrient use crops. So our green beans, whether they bush beans, pole beans, those are actually legumes, right? So they have the ability to form symbiotic relationships with soil bacteria and fix nitrogen. Now, they do not fix huge amounts, right? So maybe not as much as alfalfa or some of the other common legumes that we might be familiar with, but they don't have real high nutrient needs. And so that's one of the reasons why when you look at information about, managing the fertility in your beans, most of the time, whether you be a home gardener or actually even often if you're a commercial grower, most of the nutrition that you'll be delivering to that bean will be in the form of a pre-plant broadcast or banding, or sometimes even both, fertilizer. And so you often won't see a lot of side dressing recommendations for them. Now, when we direct seed them, the optimum temperature for bean germination is going to be between 75 and 80 degrees, but they're going to be able to germinate pretty well in that 60 to 70 range. And beans are one of those crops that oftentimes in our home gardens, we're going to try to push just a little bit, right? So about the earliest that we would see beans go in the ground in Tennessee would be about the 15th of April. Now, for some of us, for some of y'all who may be in higher elevations, kind of in the Southern Plateau region, you're going to, push that back a little bit and it'll be in later April. But oftentimes beans are one of the first warm season crops that go into the ground. We can successively plant them. We cross our fingers and hope that the first planting goes well. So we're going to seed those, 2 or 3 inches apart, about an inch deep, and we may thin to about 3 to 4 inches between beans when we get good germination. Bush beans, our fastest bush beans to harvest are going to be, right around 50 days. And then pole beans, a little bit higher than that. So what are some of the favorites in Tennessee? These are actually our numbers from our home garden variety trial from last year. So these are absolutely Tennessee gardeners giving us feedback on what some of their favorite cultivars are. And lots of times what I try to do in the trials is kind of have some old standards and some newer cultivars so that we get a good balance over how well some of the newer ones compare with things that home gardeners are pretty passionate about already. So last year's trial had Blue Lake 274, which is a very standard Blue Lake type of green bean, of course in a bush, not in a pole. And we also had Jade, and Jade has done well for us in 2 years in a row. You can see, you know, more than 4 out of 5 people who grew Jade would recommend it. It's actually Jade that's in this picture. So it's a nice dark green bean. We get good comments on flavor. We especially get good comments on appearance for our Jade beans. A little bit less beanie, so to speak, right? So if you are kind of an old-fashioned, I love my half runners and I'll let their beans fill out, not quite as much on these types of bush beans, but they're beautiful and productive and actually pretty easy to pick. Last year I also had a filet bean trial. Filet beans, I always kind of smile when I talk about filet beans because there are some gardeners in Tennessee, like our old-fashioned bean growers, don't really like filet beans, right? Because there's just not much bean in there. And so last year we had Kalima, which is a longer, thinner bean, performed well. You can see 4 out of 5 people would recommend it. They like the flavor, they like the yield. And we also had Mascot. Mascot is actually what's in this picture right here. And it's an All-American Selections winner from 3 or 4 years ago. And it is actually a container bean. So it's a pretty petite filet, shall we say. Here are 3 beans growing together. This first row right here on your left is actually the Mascot. Then we've got Provider and Jade and some of the more common ones. But you can see a short plant, smaller leaves, well branched, and it blooms. All of the flowers are going to be right there at the top of the plant. So it's actually pretty easy to pick. However, if you don't like small filet beans, then you are not going to like this bean very well. One of my master gardeners from Middle Tennessee, who is an excellent trialer in the program, sent me an email in the middle of last summer. And she was like, I don't know what is up with this Mascot. Like the beans only get 3 or 4 inches long and they just never plump up very much. And I was like, well, I mean, I hate to tell you, but it's a petite filet bean. Like they're going to be 3 or 4 inches long and they're going to be tiny. So if you don't like filet beans, it probably won't be your thing. But we've grown a lot of pole beans in the trial that have done well. The first 2 years we grew Kentucky Wonder, and it pretty much beat everything that we trialed it against. So a lot of people, Kentucky Wonder's been around since the 1880s or something. So it's been a favorite. And then Kentucky Blue also did very well last year. So we've done, you know, Malibu, some of the newer cultivars, Seychelles, which is a recent All-American Selections winner, and it did well. It holds a little bit longer on the vine, so that can be an asset as far as, you know, picking duration. And then last year we did some heirloom cultivars, and so Turkey Crawl did very well in our trial. I think one of the biggest things when it comes to beans is going to be having a plan for your trellis early on. And so if you kind of, you know, like old school or old fashioned, the teepees work very well as far as simple picking. Here we have cattle panels, which are also a really great way to train your green beans. Now these may actually be more of a half runner kind of height because you can see the tendrils are already growing off the tops of these support systems, but you know, you can even make an arch, right? So there are lots of ways to train your beans. I grew up primarily eating all half runner green beans. And we, you know, just let our runners run. And so the first time I really grew beans on a trellis, I liked them a whole lot better. And so good support system is critical for keeping your fruit clean, right? Because a lot of the diseases that we'll see on our fruit, especially later in the season, if we can get them up off the ground, get more airflow, keep those beans drier, that's going to be an asset. If you want to try something new this year, edamame could be a cool thing to grow. So these are edible soybeans. They're grown similar to other beans in the sense that we're going to direct seed them. You know, we're going to seed every 3 or 4 inches. We're going to want our plant spacing, you know, about 6 inches within the row. And these are, of course, going to be essentially a bush bean. And so we're going to have a, you know, 18 to 24 inch plant, and they're going to set, you know, kind of like soybeans in the field. The difference, of course, is that when our farmers are picking soybeans, they wait till those seeds dry down before they harvest. And so the key with edamame is we want to pick those when they are still green, right? Moist, when the moisture content is high in those seeds. And so we want to do it while the pods are still green and we see kind of a good plumping up of those beans inside that pod. And so some edamame have just a couple of seeds in there, some have 3, and essentially they're going to be cooked before eating, then they're going to be shelled, right? So one of my favorite home garden variety trial stories is probably from the first year, so this is like a 4-year-old story by now, where we had edamame in our first year, and one of the trialers sent a note back that said, you know, honestly, neither one of these edamame cultivars were very good, but they were both a lot better when you shelled them. So, I mean, you know, you can apparently eat them, but they are not very pleasant, right? Midori Giant is one that has typically performed pretty well. Envy is one that's pretty early. So there are several good options. There are dark colors, there are lighter colors. And then, of course, we have sweet corn. And sweet corn, once again, is one that sometimes we'll try to slip in there. So we may actually seed it a little bit before the frost-free date. So around that middle part of April may be the earliest that we'll see it in Tennessee. When it comes to sweet corn, for me, I want to be paying attention to the soil temperatures. And so just like most of the warm season crops that we're going to talk about, this is going to be a fairly consistent bullet point right there. 75 to 80 is going to be the optimum for most of those crops, and you're going to get the fastest germination rate. So for instance, you know, corn, if it's seeded, you know, at 75 degrees, you're going to be able to get germination in, you know, 4, 5, 6 days. Like, it's going to be pretty quick. But even if it's seeded at, you know, 60, 65 or 68 degrees, you're still going to get germination in 7 or 8 days. And so that's pretty good. The speed of germination is not just us being impatient, right? The speed of germination is also related to how much we have to worry about decay and breakdown and, you know, some of the damping off and some of the diseases that can impact our seeds in the ground. And so if we put it in there and the soil temperature is 59 degrees and it takes 14 days to get germinated, then we have a lot higher chance of that seed decaying. And that's why it's not surprising that corn, beans, some of those earliest direct seeded crops are often the ones that we see with fungicide applied, right? So if you buy seed and it's pink, it probably has a fungicide. I mean, it does have a fungicide on it. A lot of times it's Thyrum. There are some other fungicides that are used. And so what that does is gives us a little bit more protection in the ground. And so it can help us widen that soil temperature window a little bit. Now, the minimum soil germination temperature for sweet corn is about 50 degrees. And it used to be that you might be able to, you know, if you were growing some of the old-fashioned sweet corn like Silver Queen, Golden Queen, so those are normal sugary sweet corns, and those tend to be a little bit stronger at those lower soil temperatures. Some of the newer cultivars of sweet corn that we grow, what we call super sweets. Here, this is like, you know, your geeky horticultural background information, is that those super sweets and those sugary enhanced, those newer cultivars, they convert their sugars to starch slower. So as eaters, that's really handy, right? Because you can think about old-fashioned sweet corn, you needed to pick it at the peak of ripeness and you needed to cook it really soon because it had a rapid sugar to starch conversion in that kernel, right? Starch is the storage form of the sugar, and that's what that young corn seed is going to need for the future. Well, when we started selecting for a slower conversion that was good for eaters because it could allow corn to be shipped, or maybe we weren't so timely in the garden and we still had a tender sweet kernel. But what that means is for that corn seed that we're planting from a super sweet, it actually could have a lower starch. I mean, it does often. Sometimes we call them shrunken. They're literally smaller seeds when they go in the ground. And so they don't have as strong a food source to support that young germinating seedling, which means that especially, you know, 10 or 15, 20 years ago, those super sweets needed a higher soil temperature to get good germination. The breeding is helping us out a little bit. but I would still say 65, 70 degrees for good germination of those super sweets. So, you know, we're gonna seed them in rows 4 or 6 inches apart and then thin to 8 to 12 inches. We typically have about 3 feet between our rows. Corn is side dressed when it's about 12 to 18 inches tall, you know, so knee high is a good time to side dress, and oftentimes we'll side dress with a straight nitrogen fertilizer. So this would be an example of ammonium nitrate or something in that category. I've introduced the different kinds of sweet corn a little bit here. So our normal sugary or our old fashioned is typically denoted by SU. SE is sugary enhanced, and it does have a slower sugar to starch conversion. Those tend to be a little bit more tender, creamy, and the shrunken tend to be a little bit crunchier, but sweet. And so those are some of the common cultivars. Some of the ones that we've trialed over the last few years, American Dream, Temptress, and Sweetness. And then we have a lot of home gardeners that also really enjoy Obsession. It may be more kind of a commercial sweet corn cultivar, but we also have some folks who like it. We can talk about fertility, right? We can talk about germination, but a lot of times this is the biggest issue that we have in sweet corn. And honestly, this is part of the reason why we don't have great data from our home garden variety trials, because we tend to have loss. I mean, I do, right? Even in my own trials at our station farms. So we do continually have to compete. Okra is, of course, a cultivar trial that, you know, I'm doing more now than I ever did before I moved to Tennessee. That is, once again, one of the true attributes of a southern garden. I really enjoy growing okra. It's one of the toughest crops we can grow in the garden. I think for early stage growers, for whom, you know, peppers and tomatoes and those things that we're battling pests and diseases on might be frustrating, by all means, grow some okra. It can be beautiful and productive, and it's going to be one that we have kind of lower pest and disease impact with. Now, the thing about okra, and this is one that I've, you know, learned and been communicating with our home garden variety trialers over the past few years, it is absolutely a warm season crop. And so just wait till the soil warms up. You know, I'd want 70, 75 degree soil temperatures for the okra. You can see that its optimum temperature is actually sometimes reported as above 85 degrees. So it is the honest to goodness warm season crop. And lots of times we'll have some side dressing recommendations for our okra at about a month and about 2 months after we seed it. And so I have transplanted okra, and if you are really on the ball, it might be something that works well for you. It could allow you to get in a little bit early, because we really do know that okra needs warm soil temperatures. But for me, when I tried it, you know, my okra got a little bit too tall, and so I was putting in a stretched plant. So it wasn't a perfect trial on my part, but you could get an okra plant to transplant, you know, much faster than you could a pepper. So it might be something, you know, to do a little bit of a trial in your own garden. Some of the favorites in our home garden variety trials over the last few years: Clemson's Finalist, no surprise there. Candlefire, a beautiful, dark, deep red. And one of the good things that we've heard about Candlefire is that it stays on the plant fairly well. So of course, one of the challenges with okra is that it ripens pretty quick, and especially the old-fashioned cultivars tend to get tough more quickly right there on the plant. And so Candlefire got good remarks in our trials for staying relatively tender. Picking okra is something, well, it's kind of like green beans in that sense, that once you really get started in that harvest, you want to be picking every couple or 3 days so that you can get those tender, you know, 3-4 inch fruit instead of, you know, the big longer ones, which tend to sometimes get a little bit tougher. This is our trial from last year. We did Jambalaya, which is a newer hybrid green fruited cultivar, and then Hill Country Red, which is an heirloom. Both of them did pretty well. We did have some germination issues with Hill Country Red, especially early in the season. We got fewer comments about it once we got into the really warm soil temperatures. So I think that sometimes we may even see there are going to be some cultivars, especially our older ones, our heirloom ones that maybe haven't been as much selected, you know, for good, strong, consistent germination performance. Getting warm soil temperatures could be a big asset for us here. This is Hill Country Red. It's beautiful fruit, just kind of kissed with red, so not a deep, solid red, but kind of a nice, short, fat fruit. So it did perform pretty well for those who got good plants up. This is jambalaya. It's a newer hybrid that did really well for a lot of different people across the state. Cucumbers are a crop that we trial a lot. And I enjoy growing cucumbers. There's a huge variety, and we have a lot of home gardeners that grow in containers and raised beds, and so cucumbers tend to be one of our most commonly trialed crops. So you can grow them seeds, you can grow them transplants. This is a crop that it just kind of depends on, you know, if you're only growing a few and you're growing it in raised beds, grow your own transplants, buy some transplants, you know, it's no big deal. If you're growing a lot of pickling and slicing cucumbers, then, you know, it may just be that, that having a few transplants for your earliest crop and then direct seeding the rest could be a good way to go. I talk about cucumber germination a lot as an example. And my example is that if you seed at 68 degrees, you're going to get germination twice as fast, right, as if you seeded at 59 degrees. So sometimes, you know, a week delay could actually buy you back that week in simply germination speed. If you're going to try to get in early, then treated seed might be a good option for you. A lot of our cucurbits, which is the family that cucumbers are in, are not great at taking up, you know, water and nutrients under cool soil temperatures. And so, you know, sometimes putting a transplant into cool soils could be a challenge for it. And that's part of the element of transplant shock. For much of Tennessee, May 1 is usually about the earliest. But the great thing about cucumbers is that, especially the smaller ones, you know, the picklers and those kinds of things, you know, under warm conditions, you may be able to get yield in 40 days, 45 days from seeding. And so they're ones that I kind of like to plant just throughout the season. Don't feel like that first early planting is your only chance. Typically, cucumbers and a lot of the other squash that we'll talk about are side dressed when the vines are about 1 foot long. And so we're going to put about ½ pound of ammonium nitrate for a 100-foot row. I would recommend trying support of some kind, right? Especially for your smaller fruited cultivars. Picklers, even, those little cucumbers that you have a tendency to lose in the vines. So some of the slicers that have performed well for us, General Lee, Bristol, both very fairly newish cultivars, good disease resistance, because we do have quite a few between anthracnose and downy mildew and things like that. We do have quite a few leaf diseases here in the humid South. But that's another reason that, you know, we do apply good protective fungicides, but also don't be afraid to just harvest for a few weeks from those cucumbers, pull out the vines and seed yourself another set. So sequential plantings can be very good for cucumbers. Diva has been one of the seedless, thin-skinned cucumbers that's performed very well for us. On some of our compact stuff, Space Master, Fanfare, Saladmore, those are some All-American selections winners. So we tend to get good participation from our compact cucumber trials. This is an example of downy mildew. So here, these are actually two different cultivars, right? The line is kind of right there in the middle of the slide. And so this is the early stages of downy mildew on a susceptible cultivar. It tends to infect on the undersides of the leaves, and we'll get a little bit of yellow kind of chlorosis. This is a really good example right up here on this leaf, kind of in a window pane effect. So good air movement. That's why support can be a good way to both save picking time, but also keep your vines healthy. Preventative fungicides and resistance, right? So these are some pumpkins kind of invading here, but these cucumbers are an example of a more disease-resistant cultivar where, right, it's not bulletproof, but the infection will be slower in the season. This is our pickling cucumber trial from last year. On the left is Cool Customer. On the right is H19, also known as Arkansas Little Leaf. So it just kind of depends on, you know, your personal preference. If you like to do gherkins and some of those smaller cucumbers, then the Little Leaf was nice because it didn't get quite as big as fast. But Cool Customer was very productive. Here's the Little Leaf, just so you know that there is still truth in advertising. It's very, very Little Leaf. These are some of the Asian cucumbers that we grew last year. We got pretty pretty good results on both of these. I really like the Atachi. It's the white cucumber there, very easy to see and not miss in your picking. It was also seedless. Now, when I say seedless, what that means is they have the ability to set fruit without fertilization. However, they have female flowers, right, that will accept pollen. So if you're growing a lot of different cucumber cultivars, there's a reasonable chance that your seedless fruit will, in fact, get fertilized because, your bees and other insects will visit different flowers and will often fertilize those flowers. So you can get seeds in seedless fruit if you're growing a lot of different kinds of cucumbers. I'm not going to get into like a lot of pest and disease issues, but I did want to mention that striped cucumber beetles are something to keep in mind early in the season, right? Sometimes as gardeners, especially if we're talking about early blight or late blight or things like that on some of our tomatoes, we tend to think, I'll wait till I start seeing some disease and, then I'll spray it, which is not always best, right? Preventive fungicides are pretty helpful. But with cucumber beetles, you want to be ready very early in the season because it is, you can see this young cucurbit here on the left, and that is cucumber beetle feeding damage. They are the most susceptible. They're the most attractive to beetles when they're young, but they're also, because they have such a small plant area, leaf area, they don't have a lot of leaves to support themselves. A lot of feeding damage early on can really stunt them or actually kill them. So, I will put some insecticide sprays on for the first few weeks after germination to get some good leaf area. Cucumbers and muskmelons are the ones that I focus on the most. Muskmelons, I don't know if it's, if it was just luck or an increase in skill or whatever, but I didn't really ever grow good muskmelons not until I moved to Tennessee, and they've been one of my favorite crops to grow. They, like most of the others, would prefer that you get up into the 70s as far as germination temperature. So you can seed them or you can transplant them. If you're using a plastic mulch, all of that can be a great asset to warm up your soil temperatures a little bit. Once again, if you seed at 75 degrees or 77 degrees, it's going to be a whole lot faster than 65 degrees. And so, early May, right around the time that we put in our cucumbers, would be about when we put in our muskmelons. Now the spacing is going to be a little bit wider for most of our muskmelons. We have some nice compact cucumbers that we can, put at 18 or 24 inches within the row. But muskmelons, we're going to want to give them a little bit more room to vine. Some of the favorites, and we have had some good muskmelons come through the trial over the last couple of years. This is 2018, where Sugar Cube, which is a small personal size melon, so 3 pounds or so, was one of the favorites of our trial. 8 out of 10 on a rating, which is pretty good. So it had good traits for yield and taste. As one of the highest Brix measurements that oftentimes Brix are soluble solid measurement sugars that we can find in muskmelons, and it was pretty productive. It also has a little bit of fusarium resistance. This is last year's trial where we had larger muskmelons, and Trifecta is a newer disease-resistant cultivar that literally got its doors blown off by one of the old favorites. And so Ambrosia would be what I would call kind of an old-fashioned garden melon, and so really aromatic. And so you can see gardeners in Tennessee love that a little bit softer flesh and also the aroma that we associate with a muskmelon. Summer squash are probably, along with cucumbers, one of the crops that we get the best trial data out of. Another way that they're like cucumbers is that, under good growing conditions, 40 to 50 days, you can be getting fruit. Depending upon, the size and the spread, we kind of have cultivars that, are more compact or a little bit leggier, but they are upright plants, right? They are not vining plants as much as our cucumbers and things like that. So sequential planting can work really well. We want our soil temperature, once again, right, to be at least 65 or 70 degrees, which often puts us around the first part of May. Some of our favorite zucchinis over the years, Raven. This is Raven in this picture. Our trialers have tended to prefer really solid dark green zucchini, right? So a traditional look. Tigris is a very disease-resistant cultivar. It has some good resistance to some of the viruses that we see here in the South, but it tends to be a lighter, more flecked kind of appearance. And then Easy Pick Green, which we trialed last year. This is Easy Pick Green on the top and Pantheon on the bottom. These are both parthenocarpic cucumbers, right? So they, zucchini. And they will set seed without fertilization. So they're the equivalent, right, of a seedless cucumber. So it's kind of a seedless zucchini. And the asset there is that you can have a netting or screen over them if you have trouble with vine borers and things like that, because they will still produce fruit even without pollination. Pantheon here, you can see on the bottom of the screen, I left the blooms on it because it's kind of a chef cultivar where you can batter, dip, and fry those blooms. So it's often grown simply for the blooms. We got great returns from our yellow zucchini, very high ratings for both of them. Golden Star kind of has the little bit of the green on its tips, and then Easy Pick Gold is also parthenocarpic. So very good returns on the yellow zucchini. Probably my personal preferences as far as what I've seen in data for performance and yield have been the yellow squash. So two of our favorites are Zephyr here on the left and Tempest here in the middle. And what I tend to see in my own trial plots that I'm taking data off of is longer productivity window for these yellow squash than I do out of my zucchini. And oftentimes that's a health factor, but also be picking and getting yield from the Tempest and the Zephyr even after, and this is Slick Pick 26 there on the right. And we do get rave reviews, right? Last year's trial, 100% of the people who trialed them would recommend both of those two cultivars to other gardeners in Tennessee. We also grew some patty pan last year, Starburst there with the beautiful little green dot. So we had pretty good ratings on those. And then that's the heirloom Joanne et Verte in the back. Winter squash are ones that we probably don't get quite as many reviews back on from our home garden trialers. With a longer production window, there's more time there for things to go wrong. And I think that another thing that we have to keep in mind is squash bug control, right? So the longer we have those plants in production, the more we have to think about some of those insect pests. What's the big difference? The big difference is that on a winter squash, the skin will harden before we harvest it. And that is, of course, it's storage, right? It's storage life. And so oftentimes, we can scratch with our fingernail and see if that skin is hardening. We can get both vining or compact plants, and there's a lot of great cultivars. Everything from our smaller acorn squash, which tend to yield a little bit earlier, to some of the bonbon and buttercups, even spaghetti squash, to some of the smaller butternuts. And these are the ones that we've probably trialed the most often. This is one of the favorites from last year. This is honey nut. So these are small, 8-inch fruit, 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. Great texture and culinary quality. I also grew last year some North Georgia candy roasters. So if you really enjoy heirloom, squash, and a lot of those types of crops, we have some great southern favorites that you can grow. So it can be pretty cool in our southern gardens. Watermelons are probably one of the most cold weather sensitive crops that we're going to grow. And so when I say, seeds or transplants, there's lots of times when I would probably prefer a transplant for the watermelon, especially if you're growing seedless fruit. So seedless watermelons are even more sensitive to temperature. It's sometimes hard to get a good stand in the field. And they're especially one that's valuable if you have some dark, whether it be ground cover or whether it be black plastic mulch. They're ones that's great to go ahead and have some mulch around those. So of course, very frost sensitive, and once again, like cucumbers, like summer squash, they're going to get a side dressing of oftentimes just a straight nitrogen when the vines are about 1 foot long. So about 0.5 pound for a 100-foot row of like a 3400 is going to be about the side dressing for those. Pumpkins are one that if you can get good powdery mildew and insect control, they can be good options for your garden. There are a few of our newer cultivars that do have powdery mildew resistance, so those can be a big asset. And as far as from the tiny to the giant, there's a huge amount of selections. These are like a new moon. Some of the new white ones are pretty cool. These are Sunlight, which did well in our trial last year, a pretty small, very decorative, they're edible, right? But they're not great flesh quality as far as texture and taste. We have a couple in the trial this year that are actually going to be a little bit better as far as ornamental or edibles. So those are our direct seeded options, and I'm going to talk a little bit in the time that we have remaining about a few of our transplant options, and then we'll break out and do some questions. So some of my favorites eggplants that have trialed well have been the smaller fruited ones. Just make sure that you keep picking those and find a way, right, whether it be insecticidal soap or other materials, to try to keep those flea beetles at bay. In the trials that I do in Knoxville, as far as peppers and tomatoes, they are typically kind of the traditional trial model, right? So lots of replication. All of the information that I've shown you as far as cultivar trials so far have actually been ones that we include in the home garden variety trial. So they're trialed by myself, certainly in replicated plots in Knoxville, but also all across the state. We haven't really done that with tomatoes and peppers because getting consistent transplants is more of a challenge. So a lot of these numbers are actually Knoxville numbers. Pepper transplants, we'll talk about just a little bit more when I get off the slide set. But they're one of the slowest to germinate seeds. We want to provide them with really good conditions, and we want to think about what those young plants actually require when we put them in the ground, right? So to get really good root growth out of these young roots, they really need it to be 65 degrees or a little bit higher soil temperature, right? And so that is because, of cell division and cell growth, to expand that root material, but also because cold soil temperatures make it harder for those root surfaces, right, those little membranes on the roots to take up water and nutrients. So even just getting water taken up is a challenge. And so what that means is, right, if it's windy and chilly and the soil temperature is cool and these young plants get put out in the garden where there's a lot of wind and air movement and they're losing water from their leaves and the soil is cold and it makes it hard for them to take up water, then it's, it's kind of a double whammy. I know that's a very technical term. And so soil temperature is really important for a lot of things, right, that have to do with how those leaves are able to operate in their environment. So you can plant peppers reasonably close in the rows. I usually put mine 18 to 24 inches, but most, especially our newer bell plants, have a pretty compact growth habit. Now, if you like to grow, some of the hot peppers, then some of those will tend to have a little bit more leggy growth structure. I grew some poblanos last year. They're a 4 or 5 foot tall plant, right? So some of the hot peppers can be a little bit more leggy plant. Immature is green, mature is red, yellow, and orange, and most of the time we'll side dress when we have fruit that's about 1 inch in diameter. This is one of the most important notes about side dressing, and that is for peppers and for tomatoes. We are not side dressing with an ammonium nitrate because that ammonium form of nitrogen can actually increase the chance of blossom end rot in some of our fruit crops. And for tomatoes and peppers, we would recommend that side dressing be done with calcium nitrate. So easy nitrogen to take up, but in the form that is better for the plant. So some of the great performing bells that we've seen over the years, these are 2017 was my best bell pepper year. Alliance, Red Knight have bacterial leaf spot resistance. Big Bertha was a really good performer that year. It's an elongated fruit, and Macate. Those just happen to be the 3 cultivars that are on this slide. So Alliance at the top, Big Bertha in the middle, and Macate there at the bottom. These are last year's numbers, and I'm not going to overwhelm you with a whole lot of numbers, but but a lot of what you see here, Revolution, King Arthur, Makate, Playmaker, Alliance, our best performing cultivars were the ones that had the highest levels of disease resistance. And so we did have a little bit of problem, you know, with some blossom end rot on some of these, but there are a lot of good disease-resistant bells that are on the market. Here, I'm back to good, more visual representation here. Some of the best sweet peppers from last year. This is Giant Marconi here on the right. Really large fruit, you can see, in a stressful summer. Last year, of course, was hot, and so we didn't get as good production out of the bell peppers because, you know, that consistent heat through August really cut down on good fruit set because it was actually so high that good pollination and fertilization weren't taking place. So the bell pepper yield wasn't great last year. But Sweet Sunset is a good banana pepper, Cornito, Giallo, and Oranos. All of these I'm going to show you pictures of. So this is Oranos on the left, Cornito, Giallo, beautiful sweet peppers. These are also both sweet. Jimmy Nardellos are really sweet, kind of thinner fleshed fruit, and then Carmen on the right. Some people call it like an Italian bullhorn, but those are really good sweet Italian roasting peppers. These were the Cubanelles, Nassau here on the right, so it's a newer F1 hybrid. And then Sweet Sunset there in the middle, bacterial, leaf spot resistance, really productive fruit. Last year was a very good jalapeno year. And so the yield on the hot peppers was actually better in comparison to the yield on the sweet peppers under that more stressful summer. So our hot peppers kind of handle that heat and maintain their fruit set a little bit better than some of our sweet ones did. So Emerald Fire, El Jefe, those are pretty good disease-resistant cultivars. I also grew a few pretty ornamental ones. The last couple of slides here, I'll go through tomatoes relatively quick because, you know, we'll talk tomatoes when we get done. But of course, always transplanted. Some of the commercial folks, you know, 18 to 24 inches in the rows for our smaller determinate ones. My personal preference as I work with gardeners is, well, give them plenty of space, right? Because the more airflow that we can get, sometimes the less disease pressure that we're going to build. So 36, I put my indeterminates 3 feet apart to get, you know, good air movement in between, and 4 or 5 or 6 feet between the rows. So it kind of depends on how you're staking those. So there's lots and lots of options. I use the stake and weave system. So a 5-foot brand new wooden tomato stake, you know, is $1. And for even in, you know, my size trials, for an investment of say $100 a year, I can get all new stakes for my trials, which lots of times I do, both for to prevent any disease carryover, but also because, you know, wooden stakes that have been in the ground for 4 or 5 months, they tend to break off more during the season in the second year. So I use new stakes a lot. This is the highly technical nylon baler twine. And so I just keep adding layers onto my training system over time. And it's a pretty cost effective and pretty efficient. You can do it for 500 tomatoes. You can do it for 2 tomatoes. So I've seen a lot of gardeners who will actually do kind of the stake and weave in their raised beds and just have 1 stake on one end of the bed and 1 on the other end of the bed. And it can be a good system for a whole range of scales. Some of the favorites as far as tomatoes, these are some of our smaller favorites. Sun Gold, always great for taste. Tends to be a little bit on the cracking side. Juliet, Cherry Bomb, and Mountain Magic all have a little bit better disease resistance. So Mountain Magic and Juliet both have early and I think late blight resistance, and Cherry Bomb just has late blight resistance. But those have all performed reasonably well in our taste trials. Some of the favorites for our indeterminates, and these are just last year's numbers from Knoxville, so you can tell most of the time our hybrids will give us just a little bit more yield, but that's not to say that if, you know, Cherokee Purple is not your favorite, by all means grow. We still have gotten good yield out of our heirlooms as well. So here's just a couple of pretty pictures. That's Cherokee Carbon. Good taste, good texture. It's actually a hybrid, but it has a Cherokee Purple parent, and it's performed well. in our trials. And then this is a recent All-American Selections winner that, you know, just continues to perform and yield well. Last year in my trials in Knoxville, the Chef's Choice Yellow, this cultivar right here, had an average 17-ounce fruit weight. So, you know, that means that over the course of the entire season, all the fruit that came off that plant were at least a pound. So it was pretty productive and, you know, beautiful, pretty good taste as well. Some of our very discerning customers might be able to tell the difference between some of these newer hybrids and the heirlooms, but still pretty good taste. So kind of with that whirlwind tour, I will end my screen share, and we can talk about a few of the questions, Chris, and